Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, home of the modern whitetail hunter. And now, your host, Mark Kenyon.
Welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast. I'm your host, Mark Kenyon, and today in the show, we've got Adam Hayes, big buck killer from Ohio, and we're running him through the What Would You Do gauntlet, posing him some of the most difficult deer hunting scenarios and seeing how he'd handle it. All right, welcome to the Wired to Hunt podcast, brought to you by First Light. And today we are continuing our series of What Would You Do episodes. Now, you're probably familiar with this format now. We started it last summer. We did a handful last year. We've kicked off a few more this year. And now for the month of August, I want to do a 4-week run of these, leading into opening days for so many people, because I think this format in which we pose hypothetical scenarios to an expert deer hunter and then find out how they would deal with them, I think it gives us a different level of insight. It gives us a different view into how these people do what they do. And at least for myself, I'm finding it particularly interesting and fun. I'm hoping that's the case for you guys. And our guest today is someone who I think we all want a better view into because of the kind of unbelievable success he has. This is Adam Hayes, of course. He's the host of Team 200 TV. He's been on many other shows like Whitetail Addictions. He is he runs the Moon Guide company, app, product, all that kind of stuff. He's been targeting big mature whitetails for a long time now, and he's kind of made a name for himself by being one of the few people to really target the biggest of the big 200-inch whitetails. He has 4 200-inch whitetails to his name, and you know, whether or not you care about inches, I don't think it's something that anyone has to care about. But if that's your thing, that's cool. But I think regardless of 200 or 20 inches, what Adam has done is he's found a way to find and target the hardest deer to kill in any given area. And that's something that can be applicable to you, whether you're in Iowa chasing 200-inch deer or in Maine chasing 110-inch deer. We can learn something from Adam because the same things required to kill that tough buck in Iowa, similar things need to be applied to kill that old but smaller deer in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Georgia, whatever. So that's the kind of stuff I wanted to learn from Adam today. We're going to give him a whole bunch of different questions, a whole bunch of different specific scenarios, and see how he would handle them. I also brought on a guest host today. I brought my guy Tony Peterson onto the main show. Of course, he hosts the Foundations podcast on Tuesdays, which I hope you are listening to because they're really freaking good. But I also want to bring Tony on for some of these What Would You Do episodes because he's got, you know, all sorts of other crazy things going in his head that I'm not always thinking about that I thought would be great to throw at these guys and give just a little bit more diversity to the kinds of questions we're asking, the things we're thinking about, and the topics we cover. So today, Tony and I are asking Adam what he would do in some tough whitetail scenarios. I think you're going to enjoy this one. I hope you do. So let's get to it and find out what Adam Hayes would do. All right, back with me on the podcast today, we've got Adam Hayes. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here, man. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah.
How are things at Wired to Hunt World headquarters this morning?
They're good. They're good. Did some bean field glassing last night. Got a new bow coming in today. I'll be shooting, so the whitetail season is approaching quickly, and I'm getting excited. So this podcast is well timed to help scratch the itch that is very, very profound right now. How about you?
Yeah. This summer has just flown by. I don't know if it's because it drugged last year with the whole, COVID deal, and this one's just flying by. But I cannot believe it's August already. It's crazy.
It's come fast, that's for sure. So here's something I want to do, Adam. This is going to be a little bit unique compared to the past couple podcasts we've done together. The idea here is what I'm calling the What Would You Do gauntlet. So instead of me asking you, what do you think about scrapes? Or do you like grunt tubes? Instead, I'm going to lay out a very specific scenario. Basically, I'm going to tell you a story. and ask you what you would do in that situation, how you would handle this scenario, et cetera, et cetera. And these aren't going to be softballs. These are going to be mostly, they won't be softballs. They're mostly going to be tricky scenarios. And
how many lifelines am I going to get?
Yeah, we'll let you phone a friend just one time. And I think it's going to get us an interesting look into how you do this stuff, which you obviously do so well. And also with me to help with this is my buddy and co-host in many of these, Tony Peterson. So Tony is going to throw you some zingers as well. So are you ready for this gauntlet?
Man, you got me nervous now.
I think you can handle it.
I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be.
Yeah, I trust you are. So, Tony, I'm going to lead off here, but feel free to jump in when you've got one. Here's my first scenario, Adam, and this is something that I know you're familiar with. You've dealt with this scenario, but I want to really get into the nitty-gritty of what you do. So imagine it is August 1st. And you're down in Ohio, maybe like central Ohio, southern Ohio. You're driving the back roads. It's the evening. It's nice and warm. And you are just driving around. Your binoculars on the passenger seat next to you. And this is a new area. You've never been in this zone. For whatever reason, you just decided, I'm going to take a drive through a new spot and see what's out here. And while you're driving these back roads, it's the last hour of daylight. You see that big old cage lift up in the back of the bean field. And you slam on your brakes, or you quietly touch on the brakes, slow down, pull up your binoculars, and you think, wow, that is a buck I'm interested in. Like, that's a potential 200-inch type deer, or just a mega giant that definitely gets your heart beating really fast. You see it that night. It's, at this point, I don't know, let's say it's 9 o'clock in the evening. What do you do next? That's as far as I'm getting you. You see the buck. What do you do in the next half hour? What do you do the next day? How do you proceed in this situation when you're in a brand new spot? You've just seen this 200-inch type buck, but you have no permission or access anywhere in the area. What are your next steps?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's excuse me, that's half the battle right there, is just finding a big deer like that to hunt, because they're not on every farm. So, being able to locate one or know, the general area where one is at is, like I said, it's half the battle. So, I mean, first thing, obviously, I'm going to do is, try to get some landowner information and see, who owns the property, and get a look at it, from an aerial standpoint to see what the area looks like. It's kind of a catch-22 that time of the year. I mean, I know everybody's seen the velvet giants and the bachelor groups in the summertime, and the most of those deer that have been doing the same thing, all summer long in the same fields, once they shed their velvet, they're going to be gone. Sometimes they'll be close by, sometimes they're going to be a couple miles away. So that's a really difficult time to see one, and then try to plan on, if you can obtain permission, hoping that deer is going to be there once season rolls around, is really a roll of the dice. I'm a firm believer that, deer, especially mature deer, have their summer feeding patterns. And once that velvet comes off and they know what's coming, they're gone and they're vanished and they're back to their core areas, which, could be close, it could be on that same farm, or I've relocated deer, over 2 miles away once they shed their velvet and they've gone back to their core area. So it's a really tricky situation, but I mean, being in an unknown area, what more can you do other than, do a little homework, find out who the landowners are. Like I said, get a look at the aerial and see what the surrounding farms look like, see what the crops look like, because those big deer, that time of the year are going to be focused, at least in my part of the country, they're focused on, soybeans that are still green. So that's a key place to look if you are able to get permission and to focus on. But, there's so many different things change in that time of the year too, with, acorns are starting to drop. Farmers are starting to harvest crops. So, I mean, food sources can change on almost a daily basis at that time of the year too. So, I mean, there's a lot of variables to take into consideration, but I guess to try to answer your basic question, the first thing I'm going to do is, see who I need to talk to and see if I can get permission.
What's the, like, how many pieces are you going to try to get permission on? Let's say, there's the piece that you saw the deer on, but then there's also, maybe several other adjacent farms that have got good cover and good food on them too. And like you said, there's probably going to be some kind of shift. So when you see a buck like that, how wide of a net do you cast? Are you going to go and try to get permission on every piece of property within a mile of it that, has good cover on it or something like that? Like how much do you try to put in your favor ahead of the season, knowing that stuff's going to change? Or is it, man, I'm going to get permission on one piece and that'll, take a flyer and see what happens?
Well, it seems like this days you're lucky if you can get one spot. I mean, obviously the more the better, but I've always been a firm believer that I'd rather have the right 5 acres than the wrong 500. So just because you've got access to, 2 square miles of property doesn't mean that you're going to have that one key spot that you need. So, I've always focused my efforts around, sanctuaries where deer can get away from the majority of the hunting pressure and get age on them. And, that's normally where you're going to find a really big deer like that is close to some type of sanctuary, whether it's a farm that's never been hunted or, city limits where there's no hunting. But, that's always in the back of my mind as far as, a specific area, where I would think a big buck could get away from hunting pressure. If there's a sanctuary close by, that's probably going to be one of the first things I'm going to look for. And, you start knocking on doors and you knock on that one door where we've never let anybody hunt, where we feed the deer, it's a safe spot. Even if you can't get permission for that spot, chances are that's going to be a good bet for deer in that area to, funnel to once the pressure's on. So just knowing a spot like that and where it's at and maybe having permission adjacent to it or close to it, that's always been a key with me, is finding those little sanctuaries where these deer can get away from the hunting pressure. Cause it takes 4, 5, 6 years for a deer to get that big in most places. And they've got to have a safe spot. So that would probably be the key for me to focus on, is, compared to trying to have, as much permission as I possibly could. I really want, the one key spot, and that would be my first go-to.
What's your angle, or I don't know if angle is the right word, but like when you walk up to someone's door cold and you knock on that door and they answer and they look at you like, well, what are you doing here? What do you say to these people? Like, how do you present yourself? How do you have this conversation?
Boy, if we all had the answer to that one, it would be a game changer, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Right way to do that.
Yeah.
It's not easy. That's getting to be the hardest part of the game anymore. And I've actually kind of laid off of that whole going up and knocking on the door thing. I mean, if I do, try to look and act presentable, which for me can be a challenge on any given day, but, not look the part, and I'm more than happy to share, that I'm, actually filming, which over the years has helped me, but I think people kind of caught on to that whole thing. But to let people know that I'm just not out there to, kill something, I'm actually out there filming it, has helped. But like I said, I've kind of gotten away from that whole thing with knocking on doors, and I start off with a letter, handwritten letter to the landowner, introducing myself and who I am and where I'm from and what I'm doing, and, try to find out if, they would be interested in having a conversation about hunting. And I've even gone as far as just to ask for permission to photograph first, to get to meet the landowner. So that it's tough for somebody, I'm a landowner myself now, and somebody comes knocking on my door, even though I am a hunter and I'm not going to let anybody hunt here. You just never know.
That person did not do the research.
Yeah. And you just, people want to know who they're dealing with. And that's pretty hard to do the first time, they meet you when you're knocking on their door in the evening during the week as they're eating dinner. So I think the biggest thing is to try to get to know the landowner so they can get to know you a little bit before you start asking for, permission to run all over their farm and shoot their deer.
Yeah. And have you found that letter works better? Like, do you have a better yes rate now that you're doing the letter versus the walk up to the door first thing?
Yeah, but it's probably because I'm a little more picky on the spots that I'm trying to get permission than I used to be,
Yeah.
So it has helped.
So Adam, you've been you're pretty known for that strategy of, spot a big one, research the landowners and get in there and try to get permission. And you've been doing that a long time. Like, how much harder is it now? Like, what's the ratio of no's to yeses these days versus when you started doing this?
10-1, 20-1. I mean, when I got started, you could get permission anywhere. I mean, it's just not the same game anymore.
It's a lot harder now.
That's probably conservative.
Is this
to be closer to 50-1?
50-1?
Could be.
Do you? I'm always curious when I hear somebody like you talking about, finding these big bucks and seeing them, taking a drive in the evening in August or whenever you see them and however you see them. I mean, are there any secrets left when you bump into one of those bucks that you're like, I've got to get after this deer? I just always envision that deer being known by so many people because there's so many trail cameras and so much of this information is out there. Do you ever find one that's just a secret?
Sure doesn't seem like it, and you're right. There's just so much pressure. That probably has a lot to do with, the landowner stuff that we were just talking about as well, because, 20 years ago, in Ohio, it was nothing to drive around in the fields in the evenings, the bean fields, and see deer out everywhere. And you just can't do that anymore because there's so many people doing it. And the pressure is it's just tenfold what it used to be. So it makes things definitely tougher, but I think on the flip side of that, it's created a scenario where I think we have a lot more mature deer because everybody's doing the most with their property. They're letting younger deer grow and managing for trophy deer. So it's a two-edged sword.
Yeah. So let me jump in on, kind of piggyback off of that. And let's play out this hypothetical scenario a little bit further into the year then, given this new challenge of increased pressure, at least increased number of people that are pretty serious about this stuff. So let's say you saw this giant, you sent some letters, you had a farm or two where they gave you a yes. Let's say one property gave you a yes, and you're excited about it, and you come back and you start your process. And at least from past conversations we've had and past things I've seen you do, a big part of your process is observing these deer from afar, kind of narrowing down what they do, when they're going to do it, and then you wait for the right time, the right moon, the right weather, the right day of the month. And let's say late October arrives and you get the red moon and you've watched this buck come in and out of a bean field, and then you move in to kill him. Like if we're going to oversimplify and say like that's your usual process, tell me what you would do in the situation where you start doing that, you start observing, you've got some cameras out, and he's there. He's on the property you have permission on, and he's pretty frequent. Like, he's in the area, and you're thinking, okay, he's killable. I just need to wait for the right moment. But then, just as you're realizing this, you get wind of the fact that there are two other guys who also now have access to the property, and they also know about the same buck. How does your approach change with that knowledge now, that there's two other guys going after him in the same place? What do you do different?
I think most of the deer, that I've been hunting in the last 10 years, I have that scenario pretty much. I don't know where I've been where I was the only person hunting a specific deer, when there was no other pressure around. I mean, it's pretty much a constant, especially here in Ohio. So I've just kind of always been that guy that would allow other guys to pressure deer and to push them into my area. But I guess if I'm on the same farm with other guys, it really doesn't matter. I'm gonna let those guys make the mistakes and push the deer. And I want to, stack the deck in my favor as far as the best time to go in and make a move on a deer. If there's a big deer on a farm and it's hunting season, I think most guys feel like they have to be hunting. And I'm never going to advocate for somebody not to be hunting, but there's a difference between hunting, scouting, observing. If I've done my homework and I think I know where I need to be to kill a deer, I've done my scouting, maybe I've seen him make a mistake, I found that right tree where I need to be. I want to stack the deck in my favor so that the first time I go in, I think everybody would agree the first time you hunt a stand is the best time you hunt it. But I want to stack the deck in my favor so that when I go in there, everything is in my favor for that deer to be up and moving. And I think the more times you go into a farm and don't kill that deer, it gets tougher each time. Whether we want to admit it or not, that deer is probably either seeing us, smelling us, hearing us. And each time we go in, that deer is getting smarter and smarter, just like we think we are, trying to figure them out. So I want to minimize that and maybe let other guys come in, get their routine, let a big deer pattern them, and stay out of my spot until I know everything's perfect. And like I said, I'm going to scout 10 times more than I hunt because I want to do all the legwork to know exactly where I need to be. My scouting is going to tell me where I need to be to kill a big deer. It's the other factors that I pay attention to that let me know when the prime time is to go in and try to kill him. Maybe let the other guys burn their spots out, push the deer out of the spots that they're hunting, and hopefully push them in, to my farm. And that's something that happens every year. I'll stay out of my spots until all my factors that I'm looking for line up, and let other guys pressure and push those deer into my spot. And then when everything's right, slide in and try to kill them. And more times than not, if you've got the patience and the persistence to stay out of those spots until everything lines up, most of the time, at least for me, it's worked. And I've been able to kill those big deer by doing that. But I think we might have talked about it before, but I think, the toughest part of hunting big deer is actually not hunting them until everything's lined up. And then going back to what I said earlier, I'm not going to advocate somebody not hunt, but that doesn't mean that you're not out there in a tree stand observing. Maybe you're not in your kill spot. Maybe you're not in the stand where you think you're going to kill them, but maybe you're in a tree stand 300 or 400 yards away with a spotting scope, watching that area develop or trying to pick up on another little piece to the puzzle. Or maybe you're, on a completely different farm trying to pick up on a deer or find, get a look at a buck that's vanished. I mean, I'm not going to be sitting at home on the couch because it's not a good moon day or because the weather's not right. I'm always going to be out there at least scouting and observing, but I'm not going to go in and put all that effort into finding those spots and figuring a big buck out. I'm not going to go in there and try to kill them until everything's in my favor. Yeah. So I think that's the biggest difference between me and other guys. Let the other guys burn up their spots and push the deer out and let the deer, pick up on what they're doing and pattern them. And, I'll slide in when time is right in the right spot and kill them.
Yeah. Now, in our past conversations, we spent a lot of time talking about like what you think those right conditions are that you wait for. But for the sake of those people that maybe didn't hear those, can you just give me the really quick, like 1 minute overview of the key things that you're waiting for that they're going to tell you like, okay, now is the time to leave the long distance observation stand and go in for the kill?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's the battle is trying to figure out what a big deer is going to do before he does it. Through scouting and stand placement and all that. It's playing that chess match, trying to figure out where you need to be to kill him. But before I go in, there's a few things that I want to have in my favor, and any of these factors can get a big deer up and moving during daylight. I think everybody will agree, the weather is probably the most important thing. A great weather pattern, barometric pressure, high pressure, cold front is probably, the key to everything. A perfect wind direction for the deer you're hunting. That was one of the big things for me that changed my success drastically, was when I quit hunting winds that were good for me and I started hunting winds that were good for the deer I was after. You want to give a mature deer the wind to his advantage so that he feels comfortable enough to get up and move before dark. Because 9 times out of 10, a big deer that's been around 5 or 6 years, he ain't going to move before dark anyway, most of the time. But on those nights that he's going to move a little bit early, it's usually because a couple of these factors line up, and one of them in particular is going to be a wind to his advantage. So the wind, the weather, and the moon. I've just followed the moon for way too long to disregard it. It's a factor that affects animals that, everybody knows. Fishermen, serious fishermen, have followed the moon forever. I've done my own research for the last 20 years, paying attention to it and watching deer, and it affects all deer. It really affects mature deer because those deer just don't move during daylight that often. But when I've seen them move, it's happened too many times. They're moving on this red moon, and like I said, any of those 3 factors can trigger an animal to move during daylight. What I'm looking for is when you get those evenings where 2 or 3 of those factors line up. That's when stuff starts getting bloody. When you line up multiple factors, you got a perfect wind for that deer to feel comfortable enough to get up and move before dark. You throw a great weather pattern on where you got cooler temperatures, you got high barometric pressure, maybe you had a storm come through or just blow out, some weather pattern that's going to increase activity. And then you combine 1 or 2 of those on top of one of the evenings where that red moon and the gravitational pull is naturally pushing those deer to get up and feed when they want to normally feed anyway. I mean, that's what I'm looking for, and that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying I'm trying to stack the deck in my favor. I want everything, every natural factor to influence that deer to get up and move just a little bit early.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that kind of drone strike approach. You put all the pieces together, you narrow down your field of view until you know the best possible place, and then you wait till the target's right there, or at least the absolute best chances of it with all those conditions, and then you take that one surgical strike. I love it when those things line up that way too. Now, Tony, what are you thinking? Do you want to press more on this, or do you want to pivot to another hypothetical on your end? Because I'm curious what's going on in your head right now.
I want to revisit, go back to the wind direction being right for them, because this is something we get asked about a lot too. And I know, Adam mentioned that when he figured that out, kind of changed his perspective on everything. And I had a light bulb moment like that years ago with bucks on a specific spot on a ridge where the wind, there was one spot to set up where there's a little juke in the ridge with a kind of a ravine washout there that just had to take them just outside of like the real comfort zone for traveling with the wind. And that was like the spot on the spot. And I realized when I would see big bucks there, it was because the wind was so good for them, they were confident to move. But I had one little spot that I could get into a tree where it was also really good for me, blowing out over this valley. And I think this is kind of a confusing topic for people, because if you say the wind's perfect for the deer, they think, well, I can't play it then. And like, obviously the advantage is there, but this is kind of like a little current seam in a Smalley River or something, where there might be one little spot somewhere where the wind doesn't give them the advantage. And I kind of want Adam to break that down a little bit more, because I think this is such an important thing for deer hunters to really understand.
Yeah, it is. And that little spot you're talking about is what I call a weak spot. It's a spot where you can actually get within bow range of a deer on his normal travel pattern while he's using the wind to his advantage, but he can't wind you. I mean, most of my spots, my kill spots, if you want to call them that, are spots where you're virtually splitting hairs with the wind. That wind goes off track, 10 or 20 yards one way or the other. It could be game over. I'm constantly splitting hairs because it's not an easy thing to do or to find where you can get, within bow range of buck when he's actually using that wind. I mean, they're masters at that, and it's, it really is splitting hairs. And, ozonics has completely changed the game for me too, because, when every time you're going out and looking for those killer wind scenarios where, that buck is using the wind to his advantage and, just 10 yards one way or other, he could pick you off. You got to do everything you can to eliminate your scent. And I honestly believe that if guys aren't taking advantage of what's available out there, especially with the ozonics these days, you're missing the boat, because it was a game changer for me. I thought it was a gimmick at first. And I mean, I'm carrying enough stuff into the woods between my hunting gear and filming and cameras and camera arms, because I film myself most of the time. I'm not going to carry something else into the woods if I don't have to, and if I don't believe that it works. I just don't need to carry something else out with me. And, when you're constantly in those situations where you're splitting hairs on wind direction, you've got to use something like that, because you might only get one chance at it. And, throw into the equation the other deer that you're going to see before something like that happens. The does and the immature bucks and everything else, the other animals that you've got to beat before that big one moves as well. I mean, you just got to, it goes back to the same thing. You got to stack the deck in your favor with every possible thing that you can. And that's just another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. Yeah. You bring up one of my biggest challenges on some of my local Michigan properties where there's a very high deer density is that I can find these spots where I think the buck I'm after is going to come through, and where I think I've got that weak spot where the wind will be, right enough for both of us. But there's so many damn does that are going every which way that there's almost nowhere I can get to ever where there won't be does going downwind of me. And so it's constantly trying to find some way to avoid that problem where, if you get one doe to blow, that's it for the night usually, or in many cases. So how have you dealt with that?
That makes finding those weak spots that much more important. Like Tony was talking about, he's found that one little spot where, it's the wind's good for the deer, but they can't wind him. And, I find it in some of the weirdest places. I'll never forget, I know this older gentleman that's, been hunting longer than I've been alive. And he told me one time, he said, Adam, if you've gone more than 100 yards from your truck, you probably went too far. And that is proven right every year. And, with big deer, they find these out of the way spots that you just wouldn't think about. And sometimes it's close to buildings or close to a road or just different spots that most guys wouldn't pay attention to. But it creates scenarios where you can use, I can't tell you how many times I walked right down a road and then just jumped right into a tree right off the road, obviously paying attention to how far you've got to be off the road when you're hunting, but spots that you're able to access without tipping off any of the, deer in the area, and then having your wind blowing out into a spot that deer just can't get downwind of you. I mean, sometimes you really got to put some thought and effort into finding those spots, but you got to find those spots where, they can't get your wind. They just can't, no matter what they do. and especially in a high deer density area like you're talking about. You got to back yourself up to a cliff or a road or freeway or housing development. I mean, just got to think outside the box sometimes to find those spots, but they're out there. They're not easy to find, but you know, it happens a lot of times where a deer's got to make a turn in his travel route or in an area that he's forced to go through. You know, maybe it's some type of spot where there's a, you know, downed fence or where a fence stops or, you know, deep ravines, deep water. I mean, just anything that's going to force a deer through an area where he might have to drop his guard briefly. You know, and I've found those spots where you can't beat the spot and you can't beat the wind, but by the time that buck is into my wind, he should already have an arrow through him, you know?
Yeah.
The wind's blowing directly at the spot where I know I need to kill him. So, you know, by the time he gets my wind, which directly downwind of me, it should be too late. I should already have an arrow in him. So I've taken it to that extreme before just because there was no other way around it.
Yeah, and then just hope and pray that it's not the 2-year-old buck that shows up and walks through there first and blows everything up, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what about this then? Yeah. Let's take that and apply it to a situation that Tony and I actually were looking at and talking about this spring when we were out doing some scouting in Iowa. And let's say you have got a buck you want to shoot, and we're in, I don't know, late October, and you have watched him. You've caught sight of him a couple times, finally stepping out in the back corner of this field. It's October 24th, and then the 25th, for whatever reason you couldn't hunt the next day, you're watching it, he does it again. But as you look at this spot through your binos and you've looked at the map, this back corner of the field is basically like the inside corner of the beginning of like a deep cut almost. Like there's steep ridges that blow up, that come up on either side. So it's basically at the bottom of a valley. And there's this risk of swirling winds and everything that could come with being at the bottom of a narrow ravine of sorts. What do you do in that situation when you go in there and you're facing what many people would assume would be a dangerous wind situation? Do you say, he was moving here 2 days in a row in daylight, I gotta just take a swing for the fences and try? Or do you go in there and you realize, like, okay, there's no way this will work with my wind, I'm not going to hunt it because it's not worth risking him winding me? What do you do in that situation? Or what are you thinking about as you try to find a solution?
I'll tell you what, man, things change so frequently during season that I think there's a point in time where you just got to be aggressive, you know, and I think I probably learned that from, you know, the most aggressive hunter I've ever met in my life, Andre DeQuisto, the guy that invented lone wolf tree stands. He's the most aggressive hunting guy that I've ever met. And, you know, I learned a lot from the time I spent with him hunting and filming. And, you know, I don't consider myself to be an aggressive hunter, but there's certain situations, you know, you see a deer making a mistake once, you know, shame on him. You watch him do it twice, shame on you. You know, there's a point in time where you got to put a stand on your back and dive in and try to get it done. And I killed one of my biggest deer ever doing that exact same thing. You know, that was a back corner of the field. I watched him come out, you know, the night before. I knew I had to be in there. I didn't have the perfect wind direction. I actually had to walk in there with the wind at my back, but my wind was blowing straight down the fence line that he was going to be crossing instead of blowing back into the CRP, and, you know, hung a stand and watched that deer get up at right before dark at 80 yards away and, you know, killed a 208-inch deer that night. And didn't really know anything about the property other than the fact that that buck came out of there the night before, and I knew I had to be there the next night. That corn had just come down, and he was pushing a couple of does around. I knew I had to be in there. So, I mean, you're talking about a situation with swirling winds. You know, I'm going to do everything I can to be as scent free as possible. You know, I think using an ozonics in that situation is going to help tremendously. I had kind of that same scenario I found myself in a couple of years ago on an elk hunt. We were hearing this bull scream in the afternoon, and we kept getting closer and closer and closer. And he was up on this ridge, and closer we got right to the edge of where, two hills came down into this field, and we were right up against it. And I just felt like it was one of those deals where my wind was swirling. And even though I was where I thought I needed to be, I knew if that bull came down through there, that chances are he's going to pick us off. So we just backed up 100 yards to where, the wind wasn't swirling as much, and ended up shooting that bull later that evening, because he came out into that pasture and started chasing cows around. And if I would have stayed right there, it was wild, because right where we were standing is right where all the cows showed up, and they milled around those trees where we were at for half hour. And there's no way that they would not have picked us off right there if we'd have stayed right there. But I just knew I was not in a good situation, and backed up 100 yards and ended up working out. Maybe that's the scenario, is where he's coming out at. Do you know where he's going? Is he just going to come out in the middle of that field and feed? Is there a water source he's heading to? Maybe backing up a little bit to where you think that deer might be going, or what direction, instead of being right on top of him where you saw him. Maybe you need to back up a little bit and think in your head, well, where's that deer going to end up going? Or maybe you back up a little bit and you stick a decoy out to try to get him out of that corner where the wind's, swirling and not in your benefit. I mean, sometimes you got to do stuff on the cuff, and react to a situation. And, it's great to be mobile and have the opportunity to bounce around a little bit, or go in and do a hanging hunt and pick a tree. But just because you see a big deer do something in one specific area doesn't mean you have to be right in that spot to kill him. And, if you got a bad wind situation, there's only so many things you can do to control your scent. Maybe you just need to think a couple steps beyond that. Like I said, where that deer is going to end up, where he's going to go, what you could do to pull him in a different direction.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's a really good point. Tony, the next pitch is yours. Where do you want to take it?
Oh man. I have a hard time moving on from some of this stuff, but if you really want me to, I will.
Well, if you want to keep drilling in on this scenario, you can. I want you to take us wherever your whims are pointing, Tony.
Well, so with Adam, with what you just said there, I kind of want to expand on that, because there is all these different strategies, and you've talked about, being mobile, observing a ton, waiting for the right conditions, and then also bringing up Andre and moving in quick on him. But what you're really kind of saying, I think, with a lot of this stuff, is that scenario you just described there. You see one night, you see your target buck, he gets up, he hops a fence, he goes in the field here, and you go, tomorrow I've got to be there. But then you qualify that by saying, well, but if the wind is right and the conditions are right, and you got to think about what he's doing. And I think that's where we kind of lose ourselves a lot of times, is we get sort of starstruck. We see this buck do something. We go, he walked right by that tree, I have to be there. And we force it without thinking about, where did he come from? Where's he going? And trying to just factor in as much of the data as we can to make a decision and go, okay, if I can't be there, what's the next best scenario, instead of just kind of talking ourselves into hunting the wrong spot. I mean, I think I hear from hunters who kind of fall for that a lot. And it's really important to have that extra information, anything you can get to do that back up 100 yards or move down here or get on that pond he's going to.
It's a thin line between being aggressive and, being smart and trying to, sometimes you're just rolling the dice, and one thing is for sure, when it comes to hunting big deer, nothing is ever, 100% definite. I mean, things are just changing constantly, and you got to be able to adapt to that situation and make your best call. So, if the wind is bad, do you roll the dice? Do you stay out of the area, maybe observe it and see what he's doing. I mean, it depends on what the situation is. Are you early October where that deer is still going to be on a strict feeding pattern for, 2 or 3 more weeks, or is it, the first week of November, and chances are, he's going to be on a doe in the next few days and you're not going to see him again. I mean, there's just so many things you got to take into consideration. And, I think the one thing that a lot of guys need to do more of in that situation is really just step back and use your brain and think about it. Think about all the factors, and, at the end of the day, you got to make a calculated guess on what you're going to do. So, I mean, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, but I just like to try to gather as much information as I can about it and try to make an educated guess. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but a lot of that comes from, spending 40 years chasing deer,
Yeah. Yeah, there's a big confidence factor there as far as, trusting your gut on whether to move in or stay out.
What about this? What about a situation? We've talked a bunch here about what happens when you see a buck and you see him do something, and then you're going to make a play on him based on what you saw. What about the situation where you can't see him? So let's say you had a buck that you identified on a property that you were interested in targeting, and then he shows up a time or two on trail camera, in September, so you know that he's still alive and still somewhere in the general area. But now, it's early October. You still don't have a strong idea of where he is or what he's doing. It's mid-October. Still don't know where he really is. It's not obvious where his core area is. He just shows up every once in a while, randomly on a camera here, a camera there. Now it's late October. It's the last 10 days of October. It's your favorite time of year to kill a specific buck, and this is the buck you want. You still can't pin him down. You've glassed from the road. You've sat observation stands, and it's just this occasional random picture here, occasional random picture there, and now it's almost the rut. And when the rut hits, of course, the deck gets reshuffled again too. What do you do now to try to zero in on this deer? It's October, end of October, and it's about to get crazy. What are you going to do to try to find this buck? Or do you just say, hey, this is a buck that's not living on me, I'm going to move on to something else?
I think the worst thing you can do is spend too much time in the wrong area. If if you know of a big deer and you can't find him, you got to find him. And that was another thing I learned, spending time with Andre is, you got to be on the freshest sign and find those deer, because if you're in the wrong spot, you're not doing yourself any favors. And sometimes it's a matter of putting a stand on and sticks on your back and burning a little shoe leather and go and find them. And, Andre made a career out of doing that and bumping big deer out of their beds and killing them, the very next day. Cause, he would always have the wind in his face so that a big deer, if he did bump a big deer, it wouldn't smell him. He didn't necessarily care if a big deer saw him, but he didn't want a big deer to smell him. And he'd bump a big deer out of his bed. He'd have a stand on his back and immediately hang that stand, because his whole theory was he would want to be there the very next time that deer came back into his bed. Most guys jump a big deer. I'm going to let this area cool off for a few days, come back and hang a stand and let it cool off for a few more days. And they end up hunting it a week or two later. And by then that deer's come back, smelled that you were there, and chances are he's never going to be back. Andre wanted to be there the very first time that deer came back, whether it was the next day or the second or third day. He'd sit there and wait for that deer to come back and be there the very first time that buck came back to bed in that area, and killed a lot of giant deer doing that. And, a big deer is leaving sign behind that time of the year, especially with scrapes and giant rubs. And that's probably the first thing that I'm going to look for. If I can't find a deer I'm after, is I'm going to be looking for those giant rubs, because they're leaving sign behind somewhere. You might want to start on the field edges. I mean, the bedding areas is probably going to be the last place I'm going to look, because I really don't want to bust a big deer out of his bed. But, what's the worst thing that can happen? You find him and jump him out of his bed. Well, you didn't know where he was to begin with, So at least you know where he was and get an idea of what he's doing. I mean, I'm not one of those guys that's just going to sit there and just wait and hope that big deer eventually shows up. You got to get out there and find a deer. I mean, season only lasts for so long, and once the rut rolls around, you never know what they're going to be doing, and who's hunting them, and if they end up getting shot. I mean, you gotta do everything you can to find those deer that time of the year, and if you don't know where he's at, you better find him, because somebody else is probably going to.
Mm-hmm. So when you're doing that specific thing, which you just described, which is you've got to stand on your back in your burn boot leather until you find something that tells you, oh yeah, this could be it. You mentioned big rubs and scrapes. What's like the threshold for you to say, oh yeah, this is it, versus, oh yeah, this is a random big rub? If you find that first big rub and scrape and it's in good cover, do you say, okay, that's enough? Or do you need to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of these all tight together next to really great cover, and it's steaming and there's piss still in the scrape? Like, what level of hot big buck sign do you need to see to tell yourself that this is it, this is where he is?
I'm looking for multiple big rubs. I mean, when you start walking trails and field edges and you start finding rubs and scrapes, and you're starting to find, trees as big as your leg that, every, 40 or 50 yards that are rubbed, and there's a big one, working that trail. I mean, that's really what I'm looking for. It's always great to find a big rub, but when you're finding multiple rubs, or you get into a bedding area situation where there's a bunch of big rubs and small rubs in an area that looks like a big deer is spending a bunch of time, you're probably pretty close to his core area, and you just start reading the sign. I mean, you find a trail that's got giant rubs on it. I mean, you can tell what direction that deer is walking when he made those rubs, and if he's making those rubs going back into his bedding area in the morning, or making them in the evenings coming from his bedding area. I mean, it's just really about reading that sign and trying to figure out, what he's doing. But when I'm finding multiple, big rubs in an area like that, that's really what I'm looking for.
Okay. Now, how, in this scenario of late October, your target buck's a ghost and very random, and you're trying to tighten in on where he's at specifically, how do trail cameras, if at all, play into this now? I mean, we've talked about observing and scouting on foot. Are you doing anything unique with your cameras at this point to try to pick them up too?
I use a lot of cellular cameras just so I'm not going in and out of these spots, check them, especially during season. I mean, the information you can get from a cell camera during season is worth its weight in gold. So I actually run more cellular cameras during season than I do regular cameras, just so that I can get that real-time information. And if I find an area that I think a big deer is using, I'm going to have a cell camera on that rub line or scrape line to get that information instantly, instead of waiting a week and going back and checking it. I want to know right now if that's where that deer is at.
What kind of places are you putting those cameras? Is this good? Is it random at first, and then you take one of those? I mean, he shows up once, and then do you grab all of them and then zero them in on that area, or do you keep it widely dispersed? Your camera's widely dispersed to observe like all the different places he's going. I'm just curious if you adjust and slowly get tighter and tighter and tighter on him, or not.
I'll tell you what, man, I think these big deer these days are picking up on these cameras. I mean, it seems like every week I talk to somebody else that's got a story about how they got one picture of a big deer and then they never got it again, or they've set up multiple cameras, a camera on another camera to see how the deer are reacting to it, and watching these big deer skirt these cameras and walking around them, or get their picture once and then they never go by that camera again. So it's one thing to set a camera up on a scrape or a rub line, something that's going to stop that deer in its tracks and get a good picture of them. It's another thing to set a camera up, on video mode to cover a little bit of a wider area, maybe because you don't know what's coming through there, exactly where they're coming through, just to pick up on the action that, you might not know exactly what they're doing. So it just depends on the situation, but I'm gonna usually put 4 or 5 cameras in the spot if I think there's a big deer moving through there and I'm trying to figure out what he's doing. Okay. I'll very rarely just hang one camera for a specific deer.
Okay. All right. Here's a strong pivot, a hard pivot from like picking the right location or locating a deer to actually a scenario of what you would do in a tree. So let's say we are now into November and you've been trying to find this buck out, but haven't killed him yet. You're up there, you finally see him. You're in this tree November 1st and you're hunting, back near a doe bedding area, and this buck shows up. First time you finally are in a tree and you see this buck you've been trying to kill all year long, but he is out of range. He's cruising across at about 60 yards, and he's not walking away from you. He's not walking towards you. He's kind of walking parallel to you. And at the moment, he's not downwind, but if he continues on his current trajectory, and if he gets another 100 yards or so, he will hit your wind. What do you do in that situation? Do you call to a buck like that in that situation? Do you do nothing and just wait and see what's going to happen, hope he comes closer and won't catch your wind? Or would you say, he's heading in my wind, I don't want to grunt and have him go closer to downwind, I need to take the shot now at 60? What do you do then?
I kill him at 60 yards.
Okay.
I practice out to 70 yards all summer long, mainly for elk hunting, but I've killed 2 or 3 deer at 60 plus yards. And with equipment and the technology available to hunters these days, if you're not able to kill a deer at 60 yards, that you've got nobody to blame but yourself. Honestly, I mean, I'm probably the worst shot of anybody that I know. I got the shakiest hands in the world. If I can kill a deer at 60 yards, anybody can.
Okay.
It's just a matter of practice and knowing your equipment and, getting dialed in and practice. But the thing about shooting distances, it's great to be able to shoot something at 60 or 70 yards. And I'm sure one of these days I won't be able to do it anymore, but as long as I can do it accurately, I'm going to keep doing it. But practicing at 60 and 70 yards every night makes your close shots a no-brainer. I mean, I don't even think twice about my 20, 30, 40 yard shots anymore. I mean, it's, I hate to say chip shot. I'm going to knock on wood right now, but it really makes your closer shots just second nature. When you practice at those distances, it changes the game for you with your closer shots. Really believe that that's what it's done for me.
Like, are there any situations in which you wouldn't take the 60-yard shot? Like, if it was raining, would you take the 60-yard shot? If it was 15-mile-an-hour wind, would you take the 60? If that buck was on edge because he kind of knew something was going on, would you still take that shot? What about those edge situations?
Yeah, the wind's probably the big one. I mean, last thing I want to do is make a bad shot on a big animal. So normally when it's that windy, I'm not going to be taking any long distance shots. But A couple of the deer that I've shot at that distance, I've had to grunt and stop those animals because you definitely don't want to shoot a moving target at that distance. So those animals have been on alert because they heard something because I stopped them. And I think when you're a little further away like that, I think maybe the reaction might be a little bit slower than if you're right on top of them. So I just haven't seen deer react to my bow at that distance like I have, being closer to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Just because the sound isn't reaching them the same so quickly.
Yeah. They might be a little less apt to, immediately jump the string because you're a little further and the sound, the sound isn't right on top of them. So usually aim just a little bit lower on a far shot like that anyway to allow for a little bit of a reaction from a deer. But yeah, I want to be prepared to take a 60 or 70 yard shot at a deer if the situation presents itself.
I'm going to play this scenario out in a worst case way, which I know you're going to practice and you're going to do everything you possibly can so that the worst case scenario doesn't happen. But at least as my history has indicated, and I think most, every once in a while, worst case scenarios do pop up. And I'm curious to hear how you handle that kind of situation. And I know you've been in this situation. I know you had this exact same thing happen. So I'd love to understand how you would handle it today. And this situation is this. Let's say you have that buck at 60 yards. It seems perfect. It seems ideal. You take the shot, but that buck moves or something happens and you hit him and you never find him. What do you do? How do you handle that mentally? How do you handle it practically? Like, do you need to take a couple days off and get your head right? Or do you go back out the very next morning and you're hunting again? What goes through your mind and your heart and your soul and your process to recover from that situation?
Well, man, failure is part of bow hunting. I mean, you bow hunt long enough, it's going to happen sooner or later. It's just part of the game. And I believe 100% that, in life, it is 10% stuff that happens to you and 90% how you deal with it. And that might be my age talking, but I think I've learned anything, just about everything in life is a mental game, and it's how you deal with it. And, I watched a good friend of mine 2 seasons ago out in Kansas, had 2 world-class deer he was hunting, 170, 180 inch deer. And within a matter of 2 weeks, both of those deer lost half the racks. Now, how many guys is that going to happen to? 2 world-class animals, you lose them both in 2 weeks in October. Most guys are just going to be in the corner in the fetal position, crying about it. But I mean, he kept running his cameras and kept playing the game. And, in less than 2 weeks, the biggest deer of his life that he'd never seen before shows up on camera, and he ended up killing that deer, end of the season and his best season ever. The dealing with the highs and lows of bow hunting. I mean, you go from one extreme to the next in a matter of hours or days. But one thing is for sure, if you experience a little failure, you hit a buck and lose them, or the deer you've been watching for 5 years gets killed by the neighbor, it doesn't matter what the scenario is. But one thing is for sure, if you quit and give up, nothing positive is going to happen from it. If you don't go hunt, nothing positive is going to happen. You just got to realize that it's part of the game. You got to roll with the punches and know that, things could change in a matter of hours. So, I mean, it's just all about being positive and just knowing, from the get-go that, if you bow hunt long enough, it's going to happen. And there's a lot of people that talk about success being built on failure. And, the more you try something, the more you fail at it, it's just, you're that much closer to achieving your goal and being successful. So,
yeah,
I guess you got to put it in perspective and just realize that, at the end of the day, just about any type of success you're going to have is going to be built on multiple failures. So,
yeah,
you basically got three options. You can quit if you fail. You can keep going and keep doing the same things and not learn from the experience and probably keep getting the same results, or you can, think about what happened, adapt to it, change it, and try again.
Yep.
It's really that simple.
Yeah, that's simple and that hard though too, right? It's one of those things that is easy to say and then hard to manage it.
Done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and that's tough when we all put so much effort into hunting and, chasing these deer and scouting and practicing. I mean, for most guys, it's, year round, 365 days. And then you add the emotion into it and how tore up we all get about it. And then, to have the rug pulled out from underneath you and lose a deer, the EHD or another hunter, it can take the wind out of your sails. That's for sure. But you said, man, it's the highs and lows of bow hunting. And I think that's why we all love it so much, because you just never know what's going to happen. And, any amount of failures, it just makes those successes that much sweeter. There's just nothing else like it. So,
yeah, very true.
Yeah, stick with it, man. Just got to stick with it.
Yes, that's the name of the game. That's for certain. So Tony, I want you to take the wheel here. Paint a doozy of a scenario for Adam. Take us somewhere else, because I don't want to linger on the real downer of deer hunting right now. Take us somewhere better.
I've got a good one for this, I think. So way earlier in the conversation, Adam, you mentioned using, maybe hunters on the neighboring farm or the neighboring properties to your advantage, and waiting for those folks to put some pressure on the deer and position them for you. But let's say it's October, 10th, October 12th, something like that. You've had this buck scouted out. He lives in a certain property, and everything lines up. The moon lines up, the wind lines up. You're like, I'm going in there. This is the night I kill him. As you're walking in, you see a trail camera that's not yours. You get a little farther down the fence line. You look, and there's a brand new ladder stand there. And so you text the landowner, and he says, "Oh yeah, by the way, I let my nephew hunt in there. He likes to bow hunt a little bit." How does that change your plans? What's your next steps there?
Well, you guys aren't going to give me any softballs here, are you?
Nope.
So I got a new hunter to deal with on my property. That's a tough one. Tough one, because you never know what another guy is thinking. I mean, and I've had that exact same thing happen to me. Sitting in a tree stand, and here comes 3 hunters across the farm that I've had permission by myself for the last so many years to hunt, and landowner decided to give his buddies at church and their grandson permission to hunt, and all of a sudden I've gone to having a 300-acre farm all to myself to now there's 4 of us, and they're walking in with the wind at their back, and brand new ladder stand hanging 50 yards from my hang on. And I mean, you talk about a hunter's worst nightmare, especially when you're on a big deer and you've been scouting all year long, and that's enough to ruin your day.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, letting other guys make the mistakes and pressure the deer, and focusing on, the few factors that are really going to get deer up and moving. I mean, there's only so much, we can do as hunters. especially in a situation like that. I mean, what really can you do other than to just keep hunting smart and hard? And, if I've learned anything over the years, you never want to put all your eggs in one basket, because, you can have that situation happen, or you could, that deer that you were chasing gets whacked by a car, and he's laying out on the road when you pull up to the farm. I mean, so many different things that can happen. You put all your eggs in one basket. You've got to have, a plan B and a plan C. I like to have at least 2 or 3 different deer every season that I'm focusing on and, want to hunt. It's not always the case, but, from year to year, hunting specific deer, out of the 10 things that can happen, 9 of them are bad. And you have to plan for that. Just like anything else, you gotta plan for the good and for the bad. So it always helps to have a backup plan and backup farms and backup deer. And, like I said, there's only so many things that we can do. So, try to focus on what and, if you got other guys hunting your farm, when aren't they hunting? Are these guys that are only hunting on the weekends? Are guys that are only hunting in the evenings? A lot of guys don't have the ability that I have, to hunt pretty much every day of the week. So maybe you got to focus on your morning hunts, because they're not pressuring the deer in the mornings. If you got a guy, that's only hunting on the weekends or the evenings, you got to hunt when he's not there, figure out what he's doing. And because I guarantee you, if there's a mature deer, he's probably mature deer on the farm, and the guy's not hunting smart, the buck that you're after is probably figuring out what this guy's doing and patterning him. So you got to take all that into consideration and adjust accordingly.
So in that situation, do you try to get to know as much about those other hunters as you can, so you can use that to your advantage?
Oh yeah. Yep. You got to get to know them just like the deer that you're hunting.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Chances are, when I'm hunting a farm and somebody else moves in, they don't know what I know. They're not doing what I'm doing. They haven't spent the time scouting that I have. I got a really good idea of what the deer is doing and where I need to be. And the more intel that you can get from, the guy that's hunting the farm now and what he's doing and how that's going to affect the deer that you're after. I think a lot of guys think, spook a deer, that deer is going to leave the county, go completely nocturnal, never see him again. And 9 times out of 10, that's just not the case. A deer is just going to adjust his behavior accordingly, and you have to do the same.
What about during the rut? We've talked a lot here in October. We've talked about like late October. We've talked about these different ways that you're trying to zero in on a deer and adjust to other hunters' pressure and figure out how these deer are reacting to that and what they're doing. But when you throw in the variable of hot does, it kind of reshuffles everything. And with you being someone who's typically focused on a buck or 2 bucks or whatever, I got to believe that the rut can be maybe frustrating, at least in certain ways, because they become slightly less predictable. So let's drill down one more time on how you would adjust to that variable with one target buck you're after, and we've had all these things happen. Let's add all of these things up. Let's say you had this situation where you spotted him, you tried to kill him in late October. There was other hunters in there with their tree stands. You tried to go in, and there was this tough wind situation on another night when you saw him and you couldn't kill him there, and you set up downwind ways with a decoy and try to get him to come your way. That didn't happen. All this stuff hasn't worked out. Now it's November. You are out there, and there are hot does, and there are bucks chasing, and you're thinking to yourself, what am I going to do to zero in this buck now? Because he's not doing anything at all like what he was doing previously. Do you have any ways that you try to zero in on them other than just seeing or getting pictures of them? Or at this point, do you say, okay, I'm not going to obsess over his pattern because he doesn't have one. I'm instead just going to hunt the does like any other rut hunt and just wait until the one buck I like comes through and does the thing. What then?
I kind of changed my approach to the rut probably 10, 15 years ago. Obviously I'm trying to focus on specific deer, every year, and I've been doing that for decades. And, November's the worst time of the year to do that because they're the least predictable. They're not on any kind of pattern in November. You never know where they are or what they're going to be doing. And how in the world do you know, unless you're out there every day, what the phase of the rut is? Are they chasing, they seeking, they lock down, the pre-rut, post-rut? I mean, when I just threw all that stuff out the window and quit trying to figure all that stuff out and just focused on daylight activity, because at the end of the day, you're not going to kill a big deer unless he's up moving during daylight. And I'm a firm believer that there are certain times every day when deer are going to be more active, and that doesn't matter if it's October or November. But I will pay more attention to those activity times in November during the day. Obviously, if I'm hunting early or late season when deer are on a strict feeding pattern, I'm going to focus on, those mornings and evenings when that pull of the moon on top of weather and wind is affecting animals to move a little bit earlier or a little bit later. But in November, there are certain days where you've got your peak activity times are going to be hitting during the middle of the day. And whenever that peak activity time hits during the day, that's when I want to be in the woods. There's days in November that I'll completely abandon my typical morning and evening sets and just hunt from 10 to 2, or maybe sit all day, or go in the morning and hunt until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then maybe get out and change my location. But just really focusing on daylight activity and when I think those deer are going to be up and moving during the daylight, and adjust where I'm hunting accordingly. I mean, if you're hunting midday in November, you don't necessarily want to be out on the edge of a food source. You want to be back in the timber, downwind of the bedding areas, or in a funnel or corridor in between bedding areas, catching bucks traveling. But really just completely threw everything out the window that I'd ever learned or read about the rut, and just strictly focusing on daylight activity. Because if the does are up moving, the bucks are going to be up moving. And, deer have got to be up moving in order for you to kill them. So that's really been my approach.
What situation would you prefer? Would you prefer, if you had to pick, I'm going to give you 2 options, and you're only allowed to pick one of these days in the rut. One's November 5th, one's November 6th. On November, and this isn't going to be quite right because of how the moon works, but just humor me. We're going to say on one of these days, you're going to get a cold front. It's nice and cold. It's November, and you've got that like 20, 25 degree crisp morning. You can hunt that day. But the moon is not right at all. It's not a red moon. It's whatever the opposite of the red moon is, whatever you want to call that. It's the worst moon position for daylight buck activity. That's option A. Option B is there's another day in November you can hunt, and you're going to have a red moon. You're going to have that overhead moon in the day, in the daylight, towards the edge, and it should be dynamite from that perspective. It's November, but we're in the middle of a warm front, and there's like 65 degrees, 70 degrees on that day where you have the good moon. Would you rather take the hot day with a good moon or the bad moon with the nice cold temperatures? Which day are you going to hunt?
It's a good question. I'll give you another scenario. So I'm in Kansas. I'm hunting a 200 plus inch deer. I scheduled my trip to coincide with the red moon. I know that the red moon is going to hit towards the end of the week, so it's going to get better and better and better each day of the week. But when I get there, it's even hotter than predicted. It's 80, 85 degrees all week, first week in November. Not good conditions for deer to be moving during daylight. Deer aren't moving during daylight pretty much. I killed the biggest deer of my life on the red moon in the evening when it was 80 degrees that day. And I knew that if I was going to get a chance to kill that deer, it was going to be towards the end of the week. So I focused mainly on the evenings around the water sources, and ended up shooting that deer hour and a half before dark when it's 80 degrees out. No rhyme or reason to why that big mature deer should be up moving in that heat. I don't know how else to explain it other than the fact that, the red moon hit, the end of the week. Sat there for 8 or 9 days and hardly saw anything moving at all. And that deer got up almost 2 hours before dark and is up moving, trolling for does in that heat, and just no other explanation for it. So I'm not going to sit here and say that you should be hunting warmer weather, but I mean, when you've got good conditions, the conditions that I'm looking for, a perfect wind, perfect moon, and maybe, the weather's not optimal, but I've got 2 of the 3 factors that I'm looking for, I'm going to be there regardless if it's 70 or 85 degrees. Mm-hmm. And like I said, he killed the biggest deer of my life. But if you want to know what conditions I think are perfect and that I've had my best luck in November, if I wanted to create the best scenario as far as all that stuff goes, when you have a overhead or underfoot moon peaking after daylight in the morning, say it's getting daylight at 7 o'clock in the morning, and that moon is peaking at 8, 9, 10 o'clock, I've seen more big deer movement and killed more big deer in November on those late morning hunts, because when that moon peaks after daylight, those deer are going to be moving a little bit later in the morning, in the rut. If they're with a doe, following those does back into the bedding areas or searching for that next doe coming into heat. It seems like those cooler mornings when you've got a moon peaking after daylight, you've got better activity lasting later in the morning. Just hands down, if I was going to pick a time, that's what I would be looking for, is a moon that peaks late morning. It seems like the activity lasts longer in the morning, seems to, be prolonged out through midday to, you need to get into your stand before daylight and just plan on sitting, till 2 or 3 in the afternoon. But that's when I've seen the most big buck activity in November. It's not your typical red moon evening edge of the food sources. Those mornings when the moon's peaking late, hands down, been my best days in November.
Yeah, sounds like a good time to be in the tree. It's got me me itching for November. Tony, do you have any final scenario you want to play out here? Because you've got your last question here, and then I want to move to the rapid fire round of this situation.
Yeah, I have just one thing I'm curious about. So, Adam, everything that you've kind of said in this so far, and everything you're known for is, finding a target buck, locking onto that sucker, and just seeing what you can do, and even more like finding 3 of them so you have those backup deer. Is there ever a scenario in any given fall where you just go into the woods somewhere and you hunt not knowing what's in there and just decide to sit in a tree in a spot you think is good and hope something comes by, or does that never happen for you?
It's, for me, the whole thing in the fall is hunting a specific animal and playing the game with that deer and trying to figure them out. I mean, if somebody said, you go climbing this tree and at 8 o'clock, this giant deer is going to come from this direction, you'll have a 30-yard shot, and just put me on the deer. I mean, it just doesn't do anything for me. And it doesn't do anything for me personally to just go and sit in the woods and just hope something strolls by. I mean, I guess it probably comes from, chasing specific deer for over 30 years, that's really what it's all about for me. And that's what I get the most enjoyment from is trying to figure out a big deer and what he's doing and that cat and mouse game. So yeah, there's occasion where I'll go climb in a tree, stand out behind my house and just enjoy it. But it's just not the same for me if I'm not after a specific animal. So yeah, I enjoy the woods as much as the next guy, but if I'm not after a specific buck and trying to figure him out, that's not what it's about for me anymore. So I just don't enjoy that. Just going out and sitting and hoping a big deer comes by just seems like a waste of time for me. Season's so short and they come and go, and really get to appreciate, the opportunity more and more the older I get. And I want to be, I want to be in the game with the big deer and really that whole one-on-one. So it's not saying that's for everybody. I'm not saying, guys that aren't into that, it's wrong and I'm right. It's just, that's what it's all about for me. So.
All right. I can't knock you on that, Adam.
Yeah, I was just curious.
There's something about that one-on-one thing. I can certainly relate to that. No doubt about that. So, Adam,
there's
next...
nothing like figuring out a big deer. There just really isn't. They're really an amazing animal. And when you can beat an animal like that at his game on his turf, it's so rewarding to do that. And, trying to figure out what they're going to do before they ever do it. That's just what it's all about.
It's a pretty cool thing. So the next phase here, Adam, the final wrap up here is we're going to have a series of kind of rapid fire questions that I'm going to give them to you fast, and you've just got one word answer. You can't explain it. You just have to give me the one option, yes or no, or this or that. We basically ask the same questions to everyone. So I kind of already know your answer to a few of these, but we're still going to run you through it anyways. We'll get through this real quick, and then we'll wrap things up, all right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And Tony, I'm just going to steal a couple of your questions that you added to my list too, all right?
Yep.
All right. So, Adam, here we go with the rapid fire. And this first one, man, you better get this one right. Does the moon matter to deer movement? Yes or no?
Yes.
Would you take a 50-yard shot at a whitetail with your bow?
Yes.
If you could only have one of these tools for the rest of your hunts, would you choose a set of rattling antlers or a grunt tube?
Antlers.
Expandable or fixed blade broadheads?
Fixed blade.
Should you stop a buck with a sound before shooting? Yes or no?
Yes.
If you could only pick one season to scout, one of these 3 seasons, which would you pick? Winter, summer, or in season?
Winter.
Which state has the better hunters? Michigan, Ohio, or Minnesota?
OH.
Of course. In Michigan, we don't say IO after that. We say 2 different letters. But so, okay, you passed the rapid fire. I've got one final doozy for you. And here's the situation, Adam. Let's say that I am the all-powerful ruler of the world, and I have control over your right to hunt. And I'm going to tell you, Adam, that you cannot hunt at all for the next 10 years. You're done. No hunting license, no ability to hunt for 10 years. Unless you kill a 6-year-old buck this year. You have to kill a 6-year-old just mega giant buck this year. And you only have one day to do it. You get to pick one day, and you only get to hunt one location. So what I want to know is, with this very high stakes on this hunt, what's the one date of the year you're going to pick? Tell me the date you're going to pick, and then describe to me in as much detail as you possibly can this one best possible location you can think of to kill a 6-year-old mega giant that your next 10 years depends on.
Good grief. How do you guys come up with this stuff?
Just too much time on my hands, Adam.
Uh-huh. You guys had a little meeting last night on how to stump Adam, didn't you?
That's all I've been doing for weeks.
So I need to pick one day. And you said I need to pick a location or a state?
Like to tell me the tree. Like, describe your hypothetical tree. Like, it could be actually literally a tree you know of in a spot you know of, or you could paint the picture of the perfect hypothetical scenario that in a perfect world you could find. So give me the date and describe the place you would sit and hunt to kill this kind of buck that would give you the absolute best chance.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'm going to have to pick a day the last week of October. So if I have to pick one of those, I'd say Halloween. I killed most of my biggest deer the last 10 days of October. I think that's probably the best week of the year. And I guess if you're going to pick a day that last week, why not go with Halloween? So that would be my day. The perfect scenario would be on a big rub line, right on the edge of a food source with a red moon and being within earshot of his bedding area. A couple hundred yards from where he's bedding. What other information are you looking for here?
Anything else you want? This is your hypothetical scenario. So if there's any other factors you want lined up, you can line them up. I'm giving you whatever odds you want to stack in your favor on this one. I'll give it to you. Or if that's your scenario, we can let the dice roll.
No, I mean, obviously, or a red moon evening when the moon's perfect, with the wind blowing back into the bedding area from the food source, so that deer feels super comfortable to get up and move with the wind in his favor towards his food source, and then to have high pressure day, high barometric pressure, making deer more active, little cooler temperatures. I really, really like an evening where it rains in the afternoon and then clears off and the sun comes out, because it seems like deer just come out of the woodwork on those evenings. I think when everything has a little bit of water on it, it's almost like having salad dressing on your salad. Would you rather eat a dry salad or something that's got, some moisture on it? And especially that time of the year when deer are still eating beans and get a little bit of water on the beans or, clover or whatever they're eating. Just, I don't know what it is about those evenings after rain when the sun comes out, but good grief, those are great evenings for the deer to move.
I like it.
So yeah, those 3 or 4 factors. Last week of October.
What's your perfect tree look like, Adam?
I'm not as hung up on being as high in a tree as I used to be. I'm more concerned about cover. So obviously, 15 to 20 foot off the ground with plenty of cover and a big tree to break up your outline, your silhouette. I love, that question you asked me of antlers or a grunt call. When I'm after a specific deer, when I'm hunting in the evenings, especially like that last week of October, I love to do a little light rattling. If I know I'm set up within earshot of where a buck's bedding and I'm on his travel pattern, hunting close to his rub line or maybe his scrape line, and when I rattle, I just want to make enough noise so that a deer knows where I'm at, and I'm trying to imitate a couple of younger bucks, in a dominant buck area, because that's going to just piss him off, and he's going to want to get up and show everybody who's boss. And if he thinks there's a couple of younger bucks messing around in his area, it seems like it's almost too much for them not to get up. So, doing some light tickling within earshot of his bed. He's got the wind in his favor to get up. I mean, I think it's a deadly combination, especially if you rattle before you think that deer's up and moving. Because I think once a deer's up and moving, it's harder to get him turned to come your way. But if he can rattle to a big deer in his bed, I think you got more of a chance of him getting up and heading in your direction than if he's already up heading in an opposite direction. So I'd probably be doing a little light rattling right about sunset, just before I think deer are going to be up moving, when they're just laying there thinking about what they're going to do.
I like it.
That would be my perfect evening.
All right. Well, I like the setup. I have confidence in your ability. I think you would get the buck killed and you'd be able to keep on hunting. So that's what I think. So Adam, before we shut this down, can you just give us an update on where we can learn more about everything you've got going on, whether it's the Moon Guide or the show or any other projects you want us to know about?
Well, the Team 200 show is still running on the Pursuit channel. This was our 8th season. Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. for Big Buck Tuesdays. All of our old seasons are available through Waypoint TV, which, if anybody's not aware of Waypoint, it's a free app you can get on your phone. They got hundreds of great shows on there. You can get the app on your phone for free or watch it through waypointtv.com, and then they're actually available on just about every smart TV these days digitally. We did start a new YouTube channel, Moon Guide's Team 200, which has got a lot of our old episodes on it and some new stuff we're working on. Moonguide.com for the Moon Guide app or the dial. We did just rebuild the app. It's got parcel data included in it now and some other pretty cool features, completely rebuilt this year on a rock solid platform. So some pretty cool stuff in there. And as always, anybody that wants to reach out to me, you can reach me through social media, Team 200, moonguide.com, info@moonguide for the email on that. I'm a fairly easy guy to get a hold of, and I answer every email or request I get. So
that's amazing.
If somebody's got any questions about how, the moon works, what I think about it, really anything in general, I'm an open book. More than happy to talk about deer hunting and try to help guys out. So.
Well, we certainly appreciate you doing that with us here today, Adam. It was fun. And I guess my last question is, do you have the one picked out for this year yet? Do you have a buck that's going to check all the boxes that you're going to be targeting?
Man, I have 3 deer in Ohio that were all like right at that, mid 60s mark last year. And I've only seen one of them so far. And I think he's probably past the 170 mark this year. He didn't make as big of a jump as I thought, but he's super heavy, massive 10-point with a couple extra kickers. So it's going to be interesting if these other 2 bucks show up, what kind of jumps they made. So not sure that I'm got anything north of 200 in Ohio this year. Got one in Illinois that still waiting to get pictures of that could definitely crack 200 inches. Big non-typical that, was right at that 4.5, 5-year-old mark last year that could be a world-class animal this year. So I can't wait to see, know that deer made it. Just waiting to see him show up on camera. And then I'm keeping my fingers crossed that they're going to keep the border open for Canada this year, because was going to be able to hunt a world-class deer there last year and obviously couldn't get up there with the border being shut down. And if that deer made it this year, who knows what that thing's going to look like. But biggest typical frame deer I've ever seen in my life. So
Wow. Well, sounds like you got an
Could be an
exciting
interesting
fall.
season.
Yeah. Well, we wish you the best of luck, and let's chat again after you kill a couple of those big guys and find out how you did it.
Sounds good, man. Well, appreciate you guys having me on. Hopefully I didn't make a fool of myself.
No, you passed the test.
Hopefully there was something in there that somebody picked up on that'll help them out this fall. But yeah, appreciate you guys having me on. Good luck this fall, and be safe.
Thank you. Same
Thanks,
right
man.
back at you. And that's a wrap. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate it. Just a little plug here. If you're not already signed up for the Wired to Hunt weekly newsletter, get on that. That's where we're sharing all of our new stuff every week, all the new articles from the Wired Hunt website, all the new videos from the Wired Hunt YouTube channel, these new podcasts. It all gets sent out every week, along with a note from myself with updates on what I'm doing or different little tips and tricks, things like that. So you can sign up by going to themeateater.com/wired. You're going to get a little pop-up bubble that shows you the option to sign up for that newsletter. So highly recommend that and checking out all that stuff, because Tony and I and Spencer and the whole crew of folks that are doing Wired Hunt stuff now, we're busting our tails to put out a lot of new whitetail content for people that eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, people like you. So I hope you're able to check it out. Hope you enjoy it and find value in it. So that's all I got. Thanks for tuning in. I appreciate you. Until next time, stay wired to hunt.